So this is part three and the final portion of our lecture on finishing up chapter 48, and this is actually on 49.2. So finishing up our discussion of the brain. And we left off on how the hypothalamus is involved in the circadian rhythms and their regulation within the body. And I got cut off there at the end where we were talking about how biological clocks usually require some sort of external cue to remain synchronized with their environment. And so typically, for example, with our sleep cycles, the cues that are going to be relied upon are light and dark. So now on to the cerebellum. So going forward here. So the cerebellum, you can see its location there. It's a small portion here, right behind the brain stem. And it's important for coordination and error checking during motor, perceptual, and cognitive function. It's also involved in learning and in remembering our motor skills. So we talk about sometimes in athletics muscle memory, which means that if you do something over and over again as a physical motion, that it becomes almost automatic. And the portion of our brain that's responsible for that is the cerebellum. A word similar, but a very different portion of the brain is the cerebrum. So the large portion that we usually think about when we think of the brain is our cerebrum, which develops again from the embryonic telencephalon portion. And the cerebrum is divided into its different hemispheres. So there's the right and the left hemisphere, and we sometimes hear that referred to as the right brain or left brain. And each of these hemispheres consists of a cerebral cortex, which is that gray matter of our brain, and that is overlying white matter and what are called basal nuclei. And basal nuclei are the centers for planning and learning movement sequences. So learning and planning occurs in the basal nuclei. And in humans, the cerebral cortex is the largest and most complex portion of the brain. So we can see here, this is actually going back to the brain stem. So I'm going to come back to that in just a second. I want to look at the next slide first. So this is looking at the left and right cerebral hemispheres, and you can see how they are surrounding that central portion where the thalamus, the hypothalamus, is located. And you can see those basal nuclei. They're the green structures that you see there in the inside the cerebrum. But these two different hemispheres, an important structure that you need to be familiar with is the thick band of axons that actually connect the two hemispheres. And those are called the corpus callosum. And they provide communication between the right and the left sides of our brains. In general, the right half of our brain is what controls the left side of our body, and the left side of our brain controls the right side of our body. So it's actually cross-functional. So it's kind of strange to think, but it actually is how the brain's function is divided. So going back here, actually, let me go back to this other picture. This was showing how the brain stem is actually involved in interpreting those sensory inputs that come from the peripheral nervous system. And so you can see how that is, the eye is actually going to bring sensory input in, and it's going to pass through the brain stem. And also how, again, coming up from the spinal column, you're going to have input from touch, pain, temperature receptors. And the core of the brain stem has a diffuse network of neurons that are called the reticular formation. And these actually control the timing of sleep periods. And how we know this is by what we call REMs, or rapid eye movements. These neurons also control the timing of the vivid dream cycles that we have. And this is regulated again by the biological clock and the regions of the forebrain that regulate the intensity and duration of our sleep. Sleep is a very important part of our brain's functioning, and they believe it may actually play a role in the consolidation of your learning and how you remember things. So, if you're not getting enough sleep, then that actually may be counterproductive to your retention of what you're trying to learn and your actual learning, because you're not giving your brain enough time to do the consolidation of what it's trying to learn. Some animals have evolutionary adaptations that allow for a lot of activity during sleep. So this is something that you'll find in a species such as a dolphin, because what dolphins will actually do is sleep with only one brain hemisphere at a time, sleeping. So what they'll do is one side of their brain will sleep, and then the other portion will actually allow them to continue to swim, even though they're sleeping. Half of their brain is asleep, and then the other portion will go to sleep, and they again can continue to swim. So it's kind of a wild adaptation, but it makes a lot of sense. So the last thing I was going to end it with here is just talking a little bit about a couple types of imaging um, that are techniques that are used for examining brain function. So one of them is called positron emission tomography, which is a PET scan, and that enables a display of metabolic activity by injecting radioactive glucose. So again, that makes a lot of sense. Our neurons have to have quite a bit of mitochondrial activity, breaking down glucose. So if you tag the glucose, you can actually see how active a cell is within the brain by how much metabolic activity is going on. So that's how a PET scan works. And also, MRIs are a great breakthrough in seeing what's going on in the brain. And they actually have a certain type called an fMRI, which actually detects brain activity by observing the changes in oxygen consumption. And this is a picture of that. You can see that right here on this picture. And so this one is actually showing the difference between when this brain, same person's brain, is either hearing happy music or sad music. So it doesn't look like the same brain, but it is. It's just different cross sections, so that's why it looks different. So an MRI actually does, it takes images by looking through slices and then puts those all together to give you a three-dimensional view. And so we're looking at different slices in these two pictures. So that's why we have a little bit different look. But you can see here how different portions of the brain are analyzing that sensory input depending on whether that music was happy or sad. And I thought this was really a fascinating picture. And lastly, we have this diagram here, which shows some basic areas within the human brain that are responsible for different jobs. So you can see here the different lobes, the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe, and how those are color-coded and have specific functions and jobs that they coordinate. So those bands of neurons that we talked about, those billion neurons within the brain, actually get grouped together and work together to do specific jobs. So that's all we're going to cover with the brain. Be familiar with some of the things that I've gone over here. And again, we're not going to expect you to know every little detail about brain function and all the different anatomical names as you break down the portions of the brain. But these major ones I have discussed, you should be familiar with. And that's it for now. And this, just for credit purposes, this PowerPoint is derived from the Pearson's instructional resources that they make available to go along with our textbook, and also from the um, PowerPoints that are put out by Kim Foglia or in her foundation, that was made generously possible for us to make use of down through time here.